Welcome once again to the Single Malt Review, and it's another foray into bourbon territory, and going for a big one this time.
Yes, indeed. Howdy, y'all. Welcome back. That corn whiskey of last episode just got us hot to trot on that American whiskey, so we thought we might try something of just marginally higher quality. It's Booker Nose. So I guess you'd say this ain't Jim Beam, but it is Jim Beam. It's their flagship whiskey almost. Named Booker Nose because the beams, or rather the distilling beams, sort of died out a wee bit.
Wait, are they even using the Booker Nose label anymore? It's simply Booker's now.
Oh, it's Booker's.
It is Booker's.
Booker know who they're talking about. He's their, well, not their present distiller. I think he was their last head distiller, but he was very, very... Beam, though he was not, he was very highly regarded as a master distiller. I think he really... sort of oversaw, maybe not the renaissance of Jim Beam, but certainly Jim Beam's foray into really, really high quality bourbon whiskey. So obviously he didn't make this one himself, but it's made by his recipe. And it sits alongside Baker's as well, which is my personal favourite if you can find a bottle of Baker's, named after Baker Beam, the distiller before him. It's something special as well, but getting rarer and rarer, sadly. However, this one is Booker Nose. It's the flagship whiskey from Jim Beam. It's what they call a barrel bourbon. It used to be single cask. It used to have the cask number on there. Obviously, they can't quite keep up with that, and that's fair enough given the demand for these whiskies these days. So it's a vatting, but it does have an age statement, which is 7 years old in this case. Unchill filtered, easy to achieve when you've got something this strong, and uncoloured. So that's all good to see.
Fairly staggering.
Yes, indeed. Staggering strength of 65.3%, which is higher than most malt whiskies from Scotland are put into the barrel in. It could be higher than this one was put into the barrel due to a interesting quirk of how bourbon is aged in these very, very big, hot, tall, airy, they call them rickhouses, where they age bourbon. They could not be different from the damp, moist dunnage warehouses of Scotland, and because they are quite so dry and quite so hot, the sort of osmotic gradient of the moisture in the air and the moisture in the cask is such that they can lose water at a higher rate than they can lose alcohol. And to get any further into that, you need to consult a chemist, of which I am not. But the result is barrels that, as they go down, they actually concentrate the alcohol inside them, which is a fairly scary prospect. So if you get a really, really particular one, I think Buffalo Trace is famous or infamous for doing this, they can get over 70%. And that's just unnecessary, if you ask me. You can't drink that. It's a bit strange. But anyway, this one, 65.3, and I can tell you right now, it's a pretty solid bourbon, so we will investigate.
Cask strength, not single cask, but certainly a small batch. Ooh, it's a...
And it makes no bones about what it is.
That's a very heavy hit on the nose.
Yeah. Although it doesn't... It's strong and it's heavy on the nose, but that said, I've had more of a prickle of much lower strength Scotch whiskies sometimes. Bourbon is, even in this sort of fiery, entirely elemental incarnation, it's still quite a smooth drink because of all that corn. It doesn't have that punch of malt whiskey.
That is a thing I've noticed with bourbon, is that a very, even perilously potent bourbon can still be entirely sippable on its own, undiluted.
So, yeah, I can get my nose right in here, have a good sniff, and I wouldn't want to breathe too deep, but it's not going to blow up my nasal faculties like, say, getting my nose into a full-strength Ardbeg or something might do. It just doesn't have that. That prickle is not there. It's quite smooth, even as a vapour. But in terms of what I'm smelling, it's really quite primal, quite elemental, as I said. It has this huge serving of vanilla and caramel and all of the just flagship bourbon flavours. Everything you expect a bourbon to have, this has got.
So a concentrated essence of bourbon. Even that colour, it's very rich, very dark for a 7-year-old spirit. Almost like a brown ale.
That is a good colour. All bourbons, as they get over sort of 5 years old, are always going to look dark like this because... by law, in fact, there's a lot of funny bourbon laws around there, which I won't get into the mechanics of, but by law, all bourbons as most people know these days, must be aged in completely fresh casks. They have to bin the casks after they've been aged once, or I say bin, what I should say is sell to the malt whisky industry in Scotland. Which we benefit from ultimately anyway. I'm sure it's much cheaper doing it that way. But it always means that almost all bourbons, unless they're extremely young, are going to be very, very dark and very, very syrupy, very, very oak dominated, because they're in these fresh wood every single time, no matter what bourbon they are. Even if they're very, really, really cheap stuff, you know they've had the same treatment. So I guess not all bad in that case.
Yeah, that's an interesting contrast, because a bourbon barrel matured Scotch will almost always have a really characteristic pallor to it, a very, very pale yellow. For an extremely old one, say 20 to 30 years, it almost gets very slightly green. But it's very pale and worlds of difference from, this.
Well, there you can see
goodness
you can see where the colour's gone. The bourbon's pinched it all in this case. But never mind. In addition to those quite seductive caramel, vanilla, and oaky smells, there is the typical spice. There is clove is the big one for me. Always clove coming out of bourbon. Sometimes quite a bit too much clove for me. I'm not really big into that, but clove. There's cinnamon. Ooh, there's even a bit of toasted coriander seed in there for me, if you're familiar with that one. And just on the horizon, there's even some sweet Indian spices. There's cardamom and cumin in there as well. Things you don't really expect to smell or taste, but once they're in your mind, once you think about them, then you find they're clearer than you thought. They're sitting right there on the edge.
Dark chocolate, intense spices, an orange studded with cloves, all those flavours. I'm just momentarily lost for words, because this is so potent. It's so drinkable at that
typical
strength.
As it is, because of the power and intensity of this of these archetypical flavours that it brings. That's where it's special. It's not special because of something it brings that other bourbons don't. It's special because of the intensity and the purity of its flavours that it brings across. I will do something potentially quite silly and try it at full strength.
I'm now thinking, I think 4 sips of this at full strength. It's still delivering new flavours, and it's still so accessible and not a palate-destroying alcoholic burn. It's at that brutal strength.
It's... I almost had an accent there. Not something you want to recirculate through the nasal passages, certainly. It's hella warm, as they would say in America, I hope. I'm not sure how current that was. But certainly smoother than you would expect, especially if you were comparing it to, say, a Scotch whisky. I will now break this down to, let's say, a sensible strength, like 50%, and see what it's got going on.
Yeah, a generous splash of water is possible here.
That's brought the one thing out which it was missing: coconut. That's got a good hefty bin and bag of, now there's a reference that isn't going to fly internationally, never mind, ignore that one. Good hefty baking bag, I should say, of coconut, shredded coconut, desiccated coconut.
I'm getting a little whiff of the old Bounty Bar, which you may get depending where you live in the world, but not an intense coconut hit.
Coconut ice or coconut rough. Bounty Bar, I'm not sure. That might be more of a...
UK will get that.
People in the UK will know
what
what a Bounty Bar is, yeah. Ooh. So yes, that's really just more of everything going on now with that water.
That has exacerbated the vanilla and sugary smoothness on the tongue. It's gone very syrupy.
I think, though it's lost some of that absolute power, you'd have to say it's better with water, which is an easy equation to balance when it's that strong.
This is probably still like 50% plus water added.
Oh, very likely, yeah. What I like to do with this is, if I've got time to spend with it, if I'm sitting at my computer or something else, I will get a nice big ice cube, not one of those little tray ice cubes, one of these nice large ones, and I will have a straight tumbler of this, and I'll just put one of those in, and over the course of an hour, really, because of this nice big cube, it will melt ever so slowly, and every time you have a sip, it will have continued along its journey of dilution, and you'll get something a little bit different every time you come back to it. It'll start out very strong, it'll end up quite dilute, and it'll give you something ever-changing, and it's something you can really only do with really, really robust, really, really strong whiskies. Won't work with a blended Scotch whisky, won't work with something 40%, but with something as powerful as this, It's a really good way of having it, I think. I really recommend it.
You add that ice, let it evolve naturally in a way that's going to possibly unsettle the people of Kentucky.
Well, that said, I don't think they're too precious over in Kentucky. It's a long way from Rothus. I think they'd be perfectly happy for a man to have a cube down there in the American South, where the standards are, not to say lower, but they're maybe a bit more down to earth. I'm sure I wouldn't be in any fear at all having an ice with my bourbon down there, unless it was something very, very special, Van Winkle or something like that. They might take a dim view of that, but I don't think I can afford any of that anyway, so we'll just have to wait for that review. Now, I think this is quite marvellous. I should proviso that with saying the last bottle of this I bought I didn't think was as marvellous. That was the batch immediately preceding this one, or at least the last one that came to New Zealand.
That was still under the Booker No label, wasn't it?
Before it was.
It became Booker's.
This Booker's has always been Booker's.
Oh, right.
It used to be called Booker No's, as you say, but it's been under this label for some time.
Ah.
But with any batched product, it's going to vary. And
Right.
this one varies so often because this is batch number C07A12. And how often they sort of repeat, I guess you'd have to sort of look back over the timeline of releases and see what the window really was. But with any such thing, they are going to vary. And with this one particularly, I've noticed some are not as good as others. Some end up overly sweet, and I don't know why that is. I'm not really that well steeped in the particulars of bourbon aging, but
It's a quirk of that particular cask. Or
some
like
do.
that.
I think it may be a quirk of how they were aged in the warehouse. I think they may have been aged either too rapidly. They've just taken on too much vanilla.
A hot, dry summer versus
It's
tornado
more.
season.
The funny thing about rickhouses is they're so tall. They're much taller than they are wide. And at the top of the warehouse, they're very, very, very hot and very, very, very dry because the heat all rises up. Down at the bottom, they're much cooler, and so everything in there ages at different rates. And the bourbon is usually blended from a mix of all of them. With these ones, they tend to not be. I think their standard practice with these single releases is to take them from the centre of the warehouse and then tweak them with a few either side. But the centre, I think, is generally considered where the best sort of the most balanced stuff comes from. You don't get too much cask dominance from the stuff upstairs, and then you don't get any sort of maybe insipid underaging from the things down below. But it must be. It's an art of aging that they simply don't have to think about in Scotland, because it's all, well, even if it's two levels in the warehouse, they'd be more or less considered the same thing, because Scotland is sort of 5 degrees in the warehouse all year round, if that, and you just don't have to worry. The aging environment is always the same, so there's a bit more going on in these gigantic rick houses. Anyway, so I'll just give that one proviso. This is a very good bottle. I won't guarantee everyone's going to be exactly the same, but by and large, it is, I think, a fairly good quality bourbon, and a lot cheaper than the boutique bourbons. This one is certainly, it'll cut mustard with a lot of the sort of very boutique distilled, your Rowan's Creek and your what was the other one? I forget momentarily.
Noah Mills?
Noah's Mill, that's the one.
Noah's
very,
Mill,
very
that's
good one. Not quite at that level, but much, much, much cheaper, almost half the price, usually, because it comes from this Leviathan company, Beam, although now owned by Suntory, of course, although that's fairly old news now. But yeah, very, very recommendable. As for scores, I'd probably give this one, I give it an easy 82. There are better bourbons in the world, but for its price category, and especially when you consider that this is a 750ml bottle at that strength, that might as well be a litre or more of standard strength bourbon. You've really got to visualise what you're getting in terms of the alcohol in the bottle, how much whiskey versus how much water. You're getting tremendous value out of one of these bottles. If you watered that down to 40%, this would be enormous. You'd get almost a litre and a half out of that thing. So yeah, always take that into account when you're choosing your whiskey. But no, 82 from me. What do you think?
This is an exquisite bourbon. It's well up with the best I've ever had. It falls slightly short of what is for me the gold standard of fine bourbon, which is the Rowan's Creek we've reviewed previously down there in the playlist. However, this one rates an 89 from me. It is so powerful but so sippable. it is just a perfect example of a cask strength bourbon and of what the Jim Beam Company can do when they really focus
when
on
they
just
put their minds
producing
to it.
Yeah.
When they put their minds to quality, they really can achieve something, which just goes to show it doesn't matter if you're a big company. With the right attitude, there's nothing stopping you producing a quality product. And on the Beam, rather the Suntory acquisition, there's a bit of people are fairly hopeful of that, including myself, because Suntory, big company though they are, have always and continue to have a really quality-focused attitude. You have to have a quality-focused attitude when you're making and selling Japanese whiskey, which is their bread and butter, or at least it used to be before they became quite so large. And Japanese whiskey has always been quality-focused. Highest quality, highest price. That's the mantra for Japanese whiskies, and it always has been. So I don't think under the Suntory leadership we're going to see anything less out of Jim Beam whiskies, but I think we may just see something more. We'll have to find out. But anyway, that was Booker's, and I think it's quite a stunning bourbon, really, for where it's priced. I would be an easy recommendation for any bourbon fan, given how low investment it is to get into. And a bottle should last you quite a long time, given how strong it is. At any rate, this has been the Single Malt Review. We will continue cracking on here and bring you something downright fascinating, I'm quite sure, though I don't know what it is, next time. Slàinte.